A question of capacity. That's what that video was all about, featuring the Emerson children. And capacity, I think, is best raised when we talk about children. There are other types of capacity issues involving drunks, involving insane people, and other possible problems with capacity. But since all of us were children, since most of us at some point or another deal with children, since a lot of businesses depend on marketing to children, or at least even if you don't classify teenagers as children, in the eyes of the law, they are legal infants, you've got a huge market out there of sub-18-year-old buyers, and capacity issues are ever present. What's also interesting is in the internet age, as we have many people out there who are under 18 but very savvy with computers, we're having more and more questions as to their ability to contract, be bound by contract, be able to get out of contracts, which will arise via web transactions. The first thing you have to understand in this area is that we are focused simply on the individual parties to the contract. This is not a question of the interaction between the parties so much as it is simply looking at each individual party on his or her own and saying, does that person have capacity? I am obviously over 18, but when I dress up in a cute little Madeline-type bonnet, bring in my Easter basket, my Easter eggs, and dance around, perhaps I am insane. Perhaps that is where I am lacking capacity. If I truly were a child, then obviously I lack capacity simply because of mere age. The idea behind capacity as a public policy is we are trying to protect people who don't know enough. Now, I was able to, I suppose, coach the oldest child there in the video enough so that he was able to say a legally enforceable agreement. And to this day, he still knows what a contract is, that it's a legally enforceable agreement. But merely because a child can ape words, can perhaps recite language, doesn't really mean that the child, the person who lacks capacity, is able to understand the consequences. Some people don't understand what a contract is. Even if they understand that, they don't understand really the ramifications of contracts and contract law. And that is why we have the law of capacity, to try and protect those people. It forms an absolute bar to holding incapacitated people liable under a contract. It's an absolute bar, and it may seem a little bit strange in a law where we're able to make all sorts of gradations, that in this one area, it tends to be, for instance, for children, they are legal infants until they reach adulthood, and then suddenly they are transformed from people with no capacity to people with full capacity. There's no interregnum period, no area of gray in between. But that's what the law has done. It may not be fair in certain situations where a precocious child clearly knows everything you possibly could need to know to be bound, as opposed to some adults who never learn enough to really necessarily have factually the capacity, and yet legally they do. It's just a lot easier as an efficiency matter to go simply by chronology, to simply say under 18, no capacity. Now, I want to alert you to a few little areas here in capacity beyond what your book covers necessarily. First of all, the contract is voidable. It simply means that the party that has capacity can't get out, can't assert the other side's lack of capacity. It's only the party who lacks capacity, or someone acting in his or her stead, say a parent, who has the right to disaffirm. Remember Daniel crying out from the tree, disaffirm! You have that right to get out of the contract, and all you have to do is restore what you can. That's all that a child typically has to do. The child returns the beaten up, bent up bicycle to the bike shop and says, give me back my money. As long as the child is returning what he can, that is probably all he or she is obliged to do. Now, for drunks, for insane people, for other adults who lack capacity, the law is often not quite so favorable in terms of duty of restoration. We often turn it into a duty of restitution. Another thing that a person lacking capacity, such as a child, could do is actually sue to have the contract rescinded. And then if the child is sued under a contract, a child could use lack of capacity as a defense. Say, well, I didn't breach a contract because I'm not bound by a contract. Anyone who lacks capacity can nonetheless ratify a contract after he has attained capacity. So a teenager who turns 18, for instance, could, by continuing to pay rent, continuing to pay on an installment basis for some purchase, could implicitly ratify a contract that he entered into when he was a minor. It could be done expressly as well, but it could be done implicitly by retaining benefits, continuing to make payments. A drunk sobers up and looks at a contract and continues to carry out the contract that he entered into while he was drunk. Well, he's now bound through ratification. There are three little issues I want to talk about in this area, and one of them is fraud. Can you make a claim, for instance, as a business that, sure, you were dealing with someone who it turns out lacked capacity, but you were defrauded? They lied to you. That other person stated that he or she was 19 years old. You, in good faith, believed him, went along with the deal, and now they're using lack of capacity to get out of the contract. There is a trend in the law to help businesses who, in good faith, dealt with minors that they believe were majors, were adults. But it is only a trend. The old common law approach, still followed by many, many courts, is to put an extreme burden on the party claiming fraud to prove it. It's too easy otherwise for a business to do what? To assert that, hey, I thought this person was over 18. It's too easy to put a clause in a contract that everybody has to sign saying, I'm over 18. Hey, Billy, put down those crayons, step up here on the stool, and scrawl your name, sign this contract, and then come back later and say, well, he signed the contract. He said he was over 18. Courts will look very carefully at these claims. They want to protect minors. They want to protect minors from businesses that they think are skirting the edge in terms of dealing with minors, but trying to set up defenses such as fraud so that they can still bind them in the event of lack of capacity. But there are instances. I can recall a good friend of mine when we were both children who used to order all sorts of records and books and other things, and then when he was billed, he would write back or call back and say, sorry, I'm only 13. And then he would wait to see if they actually sent him something that he had to return the items by. If they didn't pursue it, if they didn't contact his parents and really give a lot of grief, in the end, my friend ended up often keeping all sorts of things and not having to pay for them. I'm not sure if courts presently would be so happy about what my friend was doing 25 years ago. But I will tell you, he is now a very successful lawyer in Washington, D.C. I guess he was getting some of his technical training as a teenager. Another issue is necessaries. Sometimes I think businesses feel that they are protected in their dealings with minors or other people that are incapacitated, premised on the notion that, hey, we're selling them necessaries. We're selling them food, shelter, clothing, education. If it were a debutante, maybe cotillion dancing lessons. We're selling them things they need. And so we are entitled to be paid. Well, it is true. If you sell a necessary to a person lacking capacity, you are entitled not to contractual amount, but to a quantum meruit or equitable amount, whatever is a fair market value, if you will, of the goods you have or services you have provided to that person lacking capacity. But it's only a reasonable amount. It's only what a court believes is right or fair. So let's say you run a grocery store and you sell a number of grocery items to a teenager who it turns out is under 18 and he wants to get out of the deal. Can you force some of the deal upon them? Yes, but probably not all of it. You look at a grocery basket and see all the stuff that kids put in there. There's a good chance a lot of it is not really what a court would view as a necessary. And the court also is free to say that was marked up too much. That is not a fair market value or reasonable value. We're not going to go with the contractual price. We're going to go with some lesser price. And the other problem with necessaries is whatever can be returned and resold is not really stuff that you can bind the kid to. For instance, a child, say, rents an apartment, and it's not an emancipated child. There's no question of this person actually somehow having capacity. This child rents an apartment for 3 or 4 months. It's a year-long lease, but he leaves after 3 or 4 months. The child owes for the fair market or reasonable value of the 3 or 4 months he lived there, but again, it may not be the rental price. It may be a lesser price. And the child does not owe on anything he hasn't yet received. So even though he signed for a year-long lease, he only owes for the fair market value for the 3 or 4 months he was actually there on the rented premises. And the last thing I want to point out is practicality. Having said all these things to kind of warn you about dealing with children, I will acknowledge that there is a practical note to this whole area, and that is whoever really controls the money is probably going to win. You've heard that expression, possession is 9/10 of the law. Well, if you have already been paid and you're a business person, there's a good chance that if you say to the child or the child's parent, look, I am not going to just return your money. I'll give you store credit. I'll work out some other arrangement with you, but I'm not going to just hand your money back for this bent-up, beaten-up bicycle. There's a good chance the child, the parent, will, because of practical difficulties in suing you, in going after you. Practical difficulties, particularly if the item just isn't worth that much and it's not worth the time and expense to go after you in court, that there'll probably be some sort of compromise measure worked out, or maybe even the child or the parent will just leave upset, take the bent-up bicycle back with them. As a practical matter, whoever really controls the money is probably the one who has a lot of leverage. If the child hasn't paid yet, if it's on a credit receipt that he can cancel, then it is much more likely the child probably can get away with enforcing his lack of capacity and making the business, in effect, take back the item and not be charged for anything. There's one key principle I think that businesses should understand in forming contracts with minors, and that is, if at all possible, do what? Get majors, get adults, get people who have capacity involved. Because if you get co-signers on the rent, co-signers on the installment loan, those co-signers cannot assert the other signer's lack of capacity. The parent cannot use lack of capacity as a defense. It is a defense personal to the one who actually has the lack of capacity. And so if you get a parent, for instance, a guardian, some other adult to also sign on to the contract, you have a right directly against them regardless of the child's lack of capacity. Now, other people can also fail to have capacity. Drunks, they can become so intoxicated, particularly if it's well known to the people dealing with them, that they may lack capacity. You get into some interesting questions, though, in terms of what if goods are passed on to innocent third parties? What if contracts are assigned over to innocent third parties who didn't know about the drunken state of the person you were first dealing with, didn't know about the lack of capacity? Those people may be protected in ways that the original party to the contract might not. Insane people. We have a little picture there of yours truly doing, I guess, what he's always wanted to do, getting in a beautiful little tutu and dancing in front of literally, I guess, about 1,000 people at the Center for Performing Arts here in Gainesville showed up for what is called the Cracked Nut, which is a dysfunctional version of the Nutcracker. And we had some rather big guys in tutus pretending to be snowflakes. There's one of them, your prof. Obviously, people who do things like that are, at the very least, eccentric. We have people like that. A university, of course, is chock full of eccentric souls. I think it's almost a prerequisite to being hired as a professor is that you have a little bit of eccentricity in your system. But being eccentric is not enough. What you really need is you need really to be so far gone that you really don't know what you're doing, and it would not be fair to hold you accountable to a contract because you really do lack any ability to wage the consequences, to understand what you're getting into. And so simply because a person dresses up in a tutu and dances for hundreds or thousands of people, for charity, mind you, doesn't necessarily mean that he is, in fact, insane. And there are a couple other categories that I find kind of interesting in this whole area. Aliens, if we are actually at war with another country, contracts with those aliens are basically, in effect, put on hold, if not outright voided, for the duration of the war. That happened with regard to contracts with German businesses, Japanese businesses, Italian businesses during World War II. Convicts in some states still lack capacity. It depends on the circumstances, depends on the state, but sometimes dealing with a convict is dealing with someone who doesn't have capacity. And just to show you how the law has changed dramatically, it was only about 100 years or so ago that women, married women, lacked capacity. The idea was, just like the marriage ceremony says, the two become one. Well, the two legally become one, and since one of them has to remain with capacity in a rather patriarchal society, who of course gets to retain capacity, it's the husband, and the married woman often 100 or more years ago had to get the husband to approve of any deals she wanted to enter into because she herself had no more power contractually than children might have. All of that, of course, is in the dustbin of history through Married Women Acts and a number of other progressive bills in the early part of the 1900s. We eliminated the principle that married women somehow had less capacity than single women. So that's it for capacity. Watch out for people running around in bonnets unless they truly are children. And even if they are children, remember the contracts you enter into with them are susceptible to voiding on their part or on the part of their guardians.